August 12, 1944, 5:52 p.m., RAF Firstfield, England, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., climbed into the cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress that had been stripped of everything except 10 tons of Torpex explosive. The bomber, officially designated BQ-8 but called a robot or drone by the men who flew them, was part of Operation Aphrodite, the U.S. Army Air Force's experimental program to turn worn-out bombers into radio-controlled guided missiles. Kennedy's mission was to take off, arm the explosives, set the radio control systems, then parachute from the aircraft while a mother ship guided it by remote control to a German V-2 rocket bunker on the French coast. Kennedy was the eldest son of Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr., former U.S. ambassador to Great Britain and one of America's wealthiest men. His younger brother John was already gaining political prominence despite being only 27 years old. Joseph Jr. had everything to live for: family wealth, political connections, a promising future beyond the war. But he had also served 2 years flying anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic, completing the required number of missions for rotation home. He was under no obligation to volunteer for an experimental program that had already killed several pilots in testing. Yet he volunteered anyway, driven by a combination of personal ambition, family pride, and the belief that Operation Aphrodite could shorten the war by destroying German fortifications that conventional bombing couldn't penetrate. What Kennedy didn't know, what the mission planners couldn't have known, was that the radio-controlled explosive-laden bomber he was about to fly was fundamentally unsafe. Within 18 minutes of takeoff, at 6:20 p.m., Kennedy's B-17 would explode in midair over Suffolk, England, killing him and his co-pilot instantly. The explosion was so violent that debris fell over a 5-mile area, and the largest recognizable fragment of the aircraft was smaller than a man's hand. The first drone mission that would claim a Kennedy's life would also demonstrate the technological optimism and operational recklessness that characterized early American experiments with remote-controlled weapons. The story of Operation Aphrodite begins with Germany's V-weapons campaign against England. By summer 1944, V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets were striking London and other British cities, weapons against which conventional defenses were largely ineffective. The V-1 launch sites were vulnerable to bombing and were being overrun by Allied advances in France. But the V-2 rockets launched from massive concrete bunkers that Allied intelligence believed were essentially invulnerable to conventional bombing. These structures, called blockhouses or hardened sites, had concrete walls and roofs up to 15 feet thick, reinforced with steel. Bombs dropped from high altitude couldn't penetrate such defenses. The U.S. Army Air Force had been developing radio-controlled drone technology since before the war, primarily for target practice, but the V-weapon threat created urgent military requirements. If conventional bombs couldn't destroy the V-2 bunkers, perhaps remote-controlled bombers loaded with enormous quantities of explosives could. The concept was straightforward: fill worn-out bombers with explosives, have a pilot take off and set the radio control systems. Then the pilot would bail out while a control aircraft guided the drone to the target where it would impact and detonate with enough force to destroy any structure. The technical challenges were substantial. Radio control technology in 1944 was primitive by modern standards. The systems used radio signals to operate the aircraft's controls remotely, but the signals were vulnerable to interference, had limited range, and required constant pilot input from the control aircraft. The explosive payload, typically 20,000 pounds of Torpex, was 5 times more powerful than TNT and filled the aircraft from nose to tail. The arming procedures were complex and dangerous, requiring the pilot to make electrical connections while sitting in an aircraft that was essentially a flying bomb. Any premature detonation would vaporize the crew instantly. The first test missions in July 1944 were partially successful. Several drone aircraft reached their targets and detonated, though accuracy was poor and the radio control systems proved unreliable. But other missions failed catastrophically. On July 30th, a B-17 drone exploded immediately after takeoff, killing both crew members. On August 4th, another drone exploded prematurely, killing the pilot and co-pilot. The cause of these explosions wasn't clear, but possibilities included premature arming of explosives, electrical faults, or radio frequency interference triggering the detonators inadvertently. Despite these failures, Operation Aphrodite continued. The military pressure to destroy V-2 bunkers was intense, and senior commanders believed the concept was sound even if execution had problems. The decision to continue operations after multiple fatal accidents reflected both the desperation to find weapons effective against hardened targets and the institutional momentum that makes stopping failed programs difficult once resources have been committed and casualties accepted. Lieutenant Kennedy volunteered for Operation Aphrodite in early August 1944, joining a unit based at RAF First Field that was preparing the next wave of missions. His motivations were complex and have been debated by historians. Some accounts suggest he was driven by family competitiveness, wanting to achieve military distinction before his younger brother John, whose PT-109 incident in the Pacific had already received significant publicity. Others suggest he simply wanted to complete one more mission of significance before rotating home. Still others believe he was motivated by genuine conviction that the operation could save lives by destroying V-weapon sites. The mission profile for August 12 called for Kennedy and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Wilford Willey, to take off in BQ-8, climb to 2,000 feet, arm the explosives through a complex series of electrical connections, verify that radio controls were functioning properly, then bail out over the English countryside. A control aircraft, flying nearby with a pilot operating the drone's controls by radio, would take over and guide the bomber across the English Channel to the target, a V-2 bunker near Mimiex, France. The plan assumed everything would work perfectly despite previous missions demonstrating that perfect execution was rare. Kennedy and Willey took off at 5:52 p.m. Radio communications confirmed that the aircraft was climbing normally and that Kennedy was beginning the arming sequence. The procedure required making electrical connections between the detonators and the radio receiver, work that had to be done carefully while flying a heavy, explosives-laden aircraft. At 6:19 p.m., Kennedy radioed that arming was complete and that he was preparing to bail out. This transmission was the last communication received from BQ-8. At 6:20 p.m., witnesses on the ground and in the control aircraft saw BQ-8 explode in midair. The explosion was described as a massive fireball visible for miles, followed by a shock wave that shattered windows in nearby villages and knocked people off their feet. The aircraft disintegrated completely, with the explosion so violent that it created a crater where debris fell and damaged buildings on the ground. Kennedy and Willey were killed instantly. Their bodies never recovered because no remains large enough to identify survived the explosion. The investigation into the accident couldn't determine the exact cause with certainty. The most likely explanation was premature detonation triggered either by electrical fault during the arming procedure or by radio frequency interference from the control aircraft or other sources. The complexity of the arming system, the massive quantity of explosives aboard, and the vulnerability of the detonators to electrical noise all created conditions where catastrophic accidents were probable rather than merely possible. In retrospect, the operation's casualty rate, 3 aircraft lost with 6 crew members killed in less than 2 weeks, demonstrated that the concept was fundamentally flawed given available technology. The loss of Kennedy, whose family prominence brought unwanted publicity to Operation Aphrodite, created pressure to reassess the program's viability. The political dimensions of losing the son of a former ambassador and brother of a rising political figure added scrutiny that previous casualties, involving less prominent officers, hadn't generated. The question was whether to suspend operations pending investigation or to continue missions against targets that commanders still believed couldn't be destroyed by conventional means. The Army Air Force chose to continue, launching additional missions in late August and September 1944. Some achieved marginal success, with drone aircraft impacting near targets and causing damage, though the accuracy remained poor and none of the hardened bunkers were actually destroyed. Other missions failed when radio control systems malfunctioned or when pilots couldn't complete the complex arming procedures successfully. The overall operational effectiveness was negligible, with enormous risk to crews and minimal damage to targets. The Navy conducted parallel experiments with Operation Anvil, using PB-4Y Liberator bombers as drones against German targets. These missions experienced similar problems, with multiple aircraft lost to premature detonations and control failures. The Navy suspended Anvil operations after losing several aircraft and crews without achieving significant results. The combined Army-Navy experience with drone operations in 1944 demonstrated that the technology wasn't mature enough for operational use, and that the concept of manned takeoff followed by remote control was inherently dangerous. By October 1944, Allied ground forces had overrun most V-weapon sites in France, reducing the urgency of destroying hardened bunkers. The V-2 threat continued, with rockets launching from mobile operations in the Netherlands and Germany, but these weren't vulnerable to drone attacks because they had no fixed structures to target. Operation Aphrodite was quietly discontinued, with the official explanation that advances in conventional bombing techniques made drone operations unnecessary. The reality was that the program had failed operationally and had cost more lives than it could possibly have saved even if successful. The technological legacy of Operation Aphrodite was mixed. The radio control systems developed for the program influenced post-war guided missile development, demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of remote control. The operational experience provided lessons about the dangers of using manned aircraft for the initial phase of drone missions, leading to later emphasis on fully autonomous unmanned systems that didn't risk crew lives. The failures also demonstrated the importance of reliability and safety in experimental weapons systems, though these lessons were often relearned in subsequent programs. The political impact of Joseph Kennedy Jr.'s death was significant for the Kennedy family. His father had groomed him for a political career, expecting the eldest son to eventually run for president. His death shifted family expectations to John F. Kennedy, who had been expected to pursue journalism or academia rather than politics. Whether John Kennedy would have entered politics if his older brother had survived is unknowable, but family members later suggested that Joseph Jr.'s death was a catalyst for John's political ambitions. The trajectory that led to John Kennedy's presidency in 1961 was significantly influenced by his brother's death in an experimental military operation that achieved nothing of military value. The broader question raised by Operation Aphrodite is why military organizations continue operations that clearly aren't working, accepting casualties without corresponding military achievements. The institutional factors include sunk cost fallacy, where resources already invested create pressure to continue despite evidence of failure, command reluctance to admit mistakes publicly, and the difficulty of distinguishing between programs that need refinement and programs that are fundamentally flawed. These factors led to continuing Aphrodite missions after early failures demonstrated that the casualty rate was unsustainable and the operational effectiveness was minimal. Modern assessment recognizes Operation Aphrodite as a technologically ambitious failure that was operationally premature. The concept of using expendable aircraft as guided missiles was sound and would eventually prove valuable with technologies that matured decades later. But attempting to implement the concept with 1944 technology, using manned aircraft for takeover and arming procedures, and accepting casualty rates that would have been unacceptable for any conventional operation, demonstrated poor judgment by commanders who prioritized achieving results over protecting the lives of men who volunteered for missions they believed would make a difference. Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy, Jr., was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, though he was serving with the Army Air Force at the time, an administrative confusion that reflected the experimental nature of the operation. The citation recognized his voluntary participation in a hazardous mission, though it couldn't acknowledge that the mission's hazards outweighed any potential military benefits. His death became part of Kennedy family mythology, the older brother's sacrifice clearing the path for the younger brother's political rise. Though this narrative simplified the complex motivations and random chance that shaped both their lives. The memorial to Kennedy took various forms. His family established scholarships in his name. The Navy commissioned a destroyer, USS Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., in his honor. His younger brother carried his memory into politics, occasionally referencing the loss in speeches about sacrifice and duty. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is the historical lesson that Kennedy's death illustrates. That technological optimism must be tempered by realistic assessment of capabilities, that experimental weapons programs require rigorous testing before operational use, and that commanders have moral obligations to refuse missions that risk lives without reasonable probability of achieving objectives worth the cost. The concrete bunkers that Operation Aphrodite targeted survived the war, and in some cases remain standing today, monuments to both German engineering and the failure of Allied efforts to destroy them. The V-2 program continued operating from mobile launch sites until Germany's collapse in May 1945, unaffected by drone operations. The thousands of pounds of explosives expended in Aphrodite missions achieved minimal destruction of German capabilities, while costing American lives and resources that could have been employed more effectively elsewhere. The drone technology itself evolved in directions that validated the basic concept while avoiding the fatal flaws of Operation Aphrodite. Modern unmanned aerial vehicles don't require pilots to take off and arm systems before bailing out. They launch autonomously or under remote control from the beginning, eliminating the most dangerous phase of Aphrodite operations. Modern guidance systems use GPS and inertial navigation rather than primitive radio control that was vulnerable to interference. Modern weapons development emphasizes extensive testing before operational deployment, learning from failures like Aphrodite that rushed immature technology into combat with predictable fatal results. The first drone missions, though failures by most measures, established precedents and provided lessons that influenced military aviation for decades. The concept of expendable unmanned aircraft executing dangerous missions was validated conceptually, even though 1944 technology couldn't implement it safely. The integration of radio control, automation, and remote guidance systems all trace conceptual origins to programs like Aphrodite, even though specific technologies have evolved beyond recognition. The willingness to experiment with unconventional weapons in response to operational requirements demonstrated adaptability that, despite Aphrodite's failures, contributed to long-term military innovation. Joseph Kennedy, Jr.'s death at age 29 represented the loss of a life with extraordinary potential, killed in pursuit of objectives that weren't achieved and probably weren't achievable with available technology. Whether his death contributed meaningfully to Allied victory is questionable. Whether it influenced his brother's political career and thereby affected Cold War history is more certain. The contingencies and coincidences that connect one volunteer pilot's death in 1944 to presidential decisions in the 1960s illustrate how individual actions in wartime ripple through history in ways that nobody could predict or plan. The Operation Aphrodite story demonstrates that military innovation involves failures as well as successes, that some experiments fail catastrophically, and that the cost of failed experiments is measured in lives as well as resources. Modern military organizations study Aphrodite as a case study in what not to do, rushing immature technology into operations, continuing programs despite mounting evidence of failure, and accepting casualty rates that aren't justified by military results. These lessons remain relevant for contemporary programs involving autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies, where enthusiasm for innovation must be balanced against realistic assessment of readiness and rigorous testing before operational deployment. The concrete bunkers still standing in France, the crater in Suffolk where Kennedy's B-17 fell, and the memorial plaques honoring volunteers who died in experimental operations all testify to Operation Aphrodite's legacy. The program was a failure militarily, a tragedy personally for families who lost loved ones, and a lesson institutionally about the dangers of technological optimism divorced from operational reality. The first drone missions killed more American pilots than German defenders, destroyed no significant targets, and contributed negligibly to Allied victory. But they also demonstrated the potential of unmanned weapons that would eventually revolutionize warfare, established principles that later programs refined successfully, and provided cautionary lessons about the costs of military experimentation that remain relevant today. Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy Jr. volunteered believing his death might matter, that destroying V-2 bunkers could save lives and shorten the war. Whether his sacrifice achieved anything beyond demonstrating that Operation Aphrodite was premature is debatable. What is certain is that his death changed American political history by clearing a path for his younger brother's rise to the presidency. Whether this unanticipated consequence justifies the loss depends on how one values the contingencies of history against the certain tragedy of lives cut short in experimental operations that achieved nothing they set out to accomplish. Operation Aphrodite stands as monument to innovation's costs, reminding future generations that not all experiments succeed, and that failure in military innovation is measured in lives that cannot be restored or replaced.